It is a long-held American tradition, putting up portraits of American presidents and then updating them with each new administration. But here's the question: is there a law that requires it? It is a question a viewer asked after noticing that President Obama's photo was still hanging in a Houston building. Jessica Borg is here now with the answer.
The practice of changing over presidential portraits from one administration to the next began after the Civil War. Is it required? Well, we turn to the U.S. General Services Administration, the GSA, to verify our viewer's question. He asked us, do government agencies have to display a picture of the current president on their walls? The simple answer is no, says the Office of Strategic Communication for GSA, an independent agency of the U.S. government that helps manage federal agencies. Its response: there is no regulation that specifies that federal agencies must display portraits of the sitting president and vice president in the space they occupy. However, GSA displays portraits of the president and vice president in the public areas of the buildings that GSA owns and operates, including locations leased by GSA, where the building is fully occupied by the federal government. Now, fully occupied is an important distinction here. Our viewer said a few months ago he noticed that in the IRS office located in this building in Greenspoint, a portrait of former President Barack Obama was still hanging instead of the portrait of the sitting president, Donald Trump. KHOU can confirm that currently President Trump's portrait is hanging in that office. It's important to note that this building is not fully occupied by the federal government and is shared with private companies. So in general, why might there be a delay in hanging a presidential portrait? It depends on when the U.S. government Publishing Office, the GPO, receives the portraits from the White House and is able to produce and distribute them. They get distributed to more than 1,600 federal buildings and military facilities. They're also available for private sale. The White House did not release President Trump's portrait until the end of October 2017, nearly 10 months after he took office. That's delayed compared to his predecessors. And a side note, the GSA says in the buildings it does operate, the portraits of the previous administration, President Obama and Vice President Joe Biden, were taken down January 20th, 2017, the day the current administration took over. So we can confirm that although there's no law in the books requiring that these portraits be hung, it is a time-honored tradition. Jessica Borg, KHOU 11 News.
And if there's something you'd like us to verify, send us an email to verify@khou.com. Also reach us on our Facebook page or Twitter using the hashtag KHOUverify.